Before we begin, imagine this. A film set filled with hundreds of people suddenly falls silent. Cameras are still rolling. Crew members forget to breathe. The director lowers his headset. Nobody speaks. Nobody moves. And in the middle of the most important scene of the entire production, one tear escapes down Zhang Linghe's face. It was never supposed to happen. Or at least that was what everyone thought. Stay with this story until the very end, because the truth behind that tear would leave the entire production questioning where acting ended and real emotion began. The final kiss scene was meant to be the crowning moment of the drama. Months of filming had led to this exact sequence. Every argument, every reunion, every heartbreak, every sacrifice had been building toward a single emotional payoff. The audience would eventually see only a few minutes on screen, but those few minutes carried the weight of an entire production. For weeks, the creative team had discussed the scene in extraordinary detail. The lighting department spent days testing different visual tones. The music team experimented with emotional compositions. Costume designers carefully selected colors that symbolized healing and hope. Even camera operators rehearsed movement patterns repeatedly to ensure every second felt cinematic. Nothing was left to chance. And at the center of it all stood Zhang Linghe and Tian Xiwei. Both had carried the production through exhausting months of filming. Long days had become longer nights. Complex emotional scenes had demanded enormous concentration. The story had become a major part of their daily lives. By the time the final kiss scene arrived, neither performer was simply acting anymore. They knew every emotional scar their characters carried. They understood every fear, every regret, every dream. The characters felt alive. What nobody realized was how deeply those emotions had settled inside Zhang Linghe. The morning of the final scene began unusually quietly. Crew members noticed that Zhang Linghe spoke less than normal. He greeted everyone politely, but seemed lost in thought. During makeup preparation, he spent long periods staring at the script despite already knowing every line by memory. One assistant later described him as someone carrying an invisible weight. Not sadness. Not anxiety. Something else. Something impossible to identify. Meanwhile, Tian Xiwei appeared focused and composed. She reviewed scene notes with the director and practiced subtle emotional expressions in front of a monitor. Everything seemed professional. Everything seemed routine. But beneath the surface, emotions were already beginning to build. Hours later, the set was ready. The final scene would take place in a beautifully constructed location designed to represent a long-awaited reunion. Soft lighting illuminated the surroundings. Artificial wind machines added gentle movement. Every visual detail felt almost dreamlike. The director gathered the cast and crew for a final briefing. His voice echoed across the set. This is the last emotional scene of the entire production. Let's make it unforgettable. Everyone applauded. Then silence returned. The cameras prepared to roll. The atmosphere became electric. Action. Immediately, both actors transformed into their characters. The emotional reunion began. The dialogue flowed naturally. Every line landed perfectly. Every expression felt authentic. Crew members watched monitors in complete concentration. The performance was extraordinary. Then came the moment. The characters finally reached the emotional climax that viewers had been waiting for throughout the entire story. The kiss. Everything slowed. The cameras moved closer. The lighting seemed softer. The entire set disappeared into the background. Only the two characters remained. The scene was beautiful, powerful, heartbreaking, hopeful, everything at once. And then something unexpected happened. A tear appeared in Zhang Linghe's eye. At first, nobody noticed. The camera operator assumed it was simply part of the performance. The director remained focused on framing. The crew continued watching. But then the tear fell. And another followed. Suddenly, everyone realized those tears had never been planned. They were not written in the script. They were not discussed during rehearsal. They were completely unexpected. Yet Zhang Linghe never broke character. He continued performing. His voice remained steady. His movements remained controlled. But the emotion was undeniable. The tears were real. Across from him, Tian Xiwei noticed immediately. For a brief moment, even she seemed surprised. Her reaction shifted subtly. Not enough to disrupt the scene, but enough for those watching closely to recognize something had changed. The emotional energy became even stronger. What had started as a scripted moment transformed into something nobody anticipated. The scene felt alive.
Raw.
Unfiltered.
Human.
When the director finally called cut, nobody moved. The silence was astonishing. Crew members remained frozen. Even experienced professionals who had spent years on film sets struggled to process what they had just witnessed. The director stared at the monitor. Then he watched the playback. Again.
And again.
And again. Nobody interrupted him. Nobody wanted to break the moment. Finally, he looked up. His eyes were wide. That was perfect. Yet the question remained. Why had Zhang Linghe cried? What caused such an emotional reaction during a scene he had rehearsed countless times? The answer slowly emerged later that evening. After filming wrapped, a small group gathered inside a quiet production room. The atmosphere was reflective. Months of work had finally ended.
People laughed.
Shared memories. Exchanged stories. Then the conversation turned toward the final scene. Someone asked Zhang Linghe about the tears. At first he smiled. Then he became thoughtful. His response surprised everyone. He explained that during the final kiss scene, he suddenly realized the journey was ending. Not just for the characters. For everyone.
The cast.
The crew. The friendships. The daily routines. The shared experiences. Everything that had become normal for months would disappear after that day. The realization hit him unexpectedly. In the middle of the scene, he began remembering the first day of filming. The nervous excitement. The early rehearsals. The difficult scenes. The laughter between takes. The challenges everyone overcame together. Thousands of memories rushed into his mind at once. And suddenly the emotional wall he had maintained for months collapsed. The tears arrived naturally. Not because of one person. Not because of one specific moment. But because an entire chapter of life was ending. The room became quiet after his explanation. Several crew members admitted they felt exactly the same way. Others confessed they had nearly cried while watching the final take. Even the director acknowledged feeling emotional during playback. What made the story remarkable was not the tears themselves. It was what they represented. Sometimes the strongest emotions appear when people least expect them. Sometimes endings affect us more deeply than beginnings. Sometimes saying goodbye to a journey feels harder than starting one. And sometimes a single tear can tell a story that hundreds of lines of dialogue never could. Months later, whenever members of the production looked back on the project, they rarely discussed technical achievements first. They talked about that final day, that final scene, that unexpected tear. The moment when a fictional story reached its conclusion and real emotion quietly emerged in front of the cameras. And perhaps that is why the scene became legendary among those who witnessed it. Because for a few unforgettable seconds, nobody knew where performance ended and genuine feeling began. The cameras captured something rare. Something impossible to script. Something impossible to recreate. A moment that belonged entirely to that day. A moment that reminded everyone why stories matter. And a moment that revealed why Zhang Linghe cried during the final kiss scene with Tian Xiwei. Not because the script demanded it, but because some endings are simply too meaningful to leave without emotion.